How in the world are teams going to game plan to stop the Sacramento Kings this season? And will the Warriors game plan from last season's playoffs continue to work? To discuss that, I'm joined by Chris Biderman of the Sacramento Bee right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all offseason long. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports reporter and producer for ABC 10 News. I'm very confident in the additions that the Sacramento Kings made. And as you know, I'm very confident in the continuation of this Kings core and them getting more time together. I think the Sacramento Kings offense is even more dangerous than it was last season. And absolutely, they're capable of being even better offensively than they were last season. That's going to be a major feat considering they were on a historic level last year. But I don't know how teams are going to stop a Kings offense with the amount of weapons that they have. The only example that we have of a game plan really, truly consistently working against Sacramento was the Golden State Warriors game plan from the playoffs last season. And even then, we're not talking about a game plan that completely shut the Kings down. We're talking a game plan that forced 7 games. And while I'm not going to disrespect the Warriors by saying that they barely defeated the Sacramento Kings, we can say with confidence that a couple things go the Sacramento Kings way in that series. It's a completely different outcome, right? I don't think that's a cocky or arrogant thing to say, and that's not necessarily revisionist history. The Warriors won fair and square, and the reason why they were able to come back from down 0-2 and win that series was because of the game plan that they had, which really isolated a lot of Sacramento Kings when they were known for such a dynamic and free-flowing team offense. Will that game plan continue to work? Is it a good thing that the Kings are going to see the Warriors so much early on in the season that they're going to have their chance to address that game plan right away? And will other teams look to what the Warriors did and try and implement that game plan? Are other teams even capable of pulling off what the Warriors were able to pull off? Or is it specific to the Warriors because of the personnel that they have? Guys like Kevon Looney and Draymond Green, for example. These are all things that I'm going to discuss with Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee. Chris does a phenomenal job covering the Kings, covering the Niners, covering sports in general there with the Bee. Also, if you're looking for a Niners podcast, look no further than the Candlestick Chronicles podcast. He and also friend of the show, Kyle Madsen, both host that. They do a phenomenal job. And I'm so happy anytime that I can have Chris Biderman on the show. So let's talk about game planning against the Sacramento Kings with Chris Biderman right here on Locked On Kings. The last time we saw the Sacramento Kings play basketball, the Golden State Warriors had a pretty solid game plan against them. It ended up working well enough for the Warriors to win that series. And now that we don't necessarily expect the Kings to take any team by surprise, the question is, will that game plan continue to work against Sacramento? Did the Warriors figure out how to crack and beat the Kings, or can the Kings beat that game plan? And are other teams going to be capable of executing that game plan? Well, here to discuss all of this in hopefully a manner that's easy to understand, it is Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee. Does a phenomenal job covering Sacramento and greater Sacramento area sports. Really jumped on the Kings beat last season and is going to hopefully continue it this season, right, Chris? You're going to keep on that Kings coverage while also sprinkling in the Niners like you do over there.
Oh yeah, there'll be a little bit of everything over at the Bee, trying to be as multifaceted as possible, including our Sacramento Kings.
He's a man of many talents, including podcasting too. Chris Biderman is one of the hosts of the Candlestick Chronicles podcast. So if you're looking for something to listen to get you hyped and excited for week 1 of the 49ers season and what the hell's going on with Mr. Nick Bosa, make sure you check out the Candlestick Chronicles podcast too, Chris. But let's talk some Kings basketball here. Like, we've probably already discussed this before, so we'll do this really briefly, but just a refresher. When it came to the Warriors game plan, and it comes when there's a game plan to stop the Sacramento Kings, what do you think was and is required to be effective against Sacramento?
It was really win the rebounding battle and allow Domantas Sabonis room to shoot while overplaying a lot of the Kings shooters, right? Like trying to deny them the ball and easy access to catch and shoot threes and what made the Kings so successful during the regular season. Domantas Sabonis wasn't a bad shooter during the season, and he even made threes at a respectable clip. But in the playoffs, it was just a little bit different. And, those shots weren't falling for him. You could see him lose a little bit of confidence there. And even after the season ended, in his end of season press conference, he mentioned a big goal of his was to improve his confidence with his jumper so teams don't play off him and clog up passing lanes and focus on getting rebounds and all those things. So, with the addition of some of the guys, the Kings have, you have more shooting in Sasha Vezenkov and Chris Duarte. You're getting two pretty good high-level shooters in addition to what the Kings already have. So I think the Kings probably are looking for more optionality when it comes to reliable shooting. So they're not just relying on Keegan Murray and Kevin Huerter, who was really streaky last year. I know his numbers overall bore out pretty good, but there were times where he's hitting 55% of his threes over a month to 6 week stretch. And then he's, around 20% for another month. And it all evened out to a very respectable 40%. But, you need Kevin Huerter to be a little bit more consistent. But I like what the Kings did this offseason in terms of getting depth. I don't know how much what they did necessarily helps them for that Warriors specific game plan. I think what the Warriors specifically with Kevon Looney are a little bit unique relative to the rest of the league because Looney is a pretty unique rebounder. He's one of the best offensive rebounders in the league, obviously, and just overall a really good rebounder for his size in particular. But, I don't know that the Warriors really created a blueprint because Kevon Looney is a little bit unique in that regard. Like not every team has that type of rebounder with there. But when you get to the playoffs, like that'll be interesting to see. And I think what a big lesson for the Kings coming out of last season is just how much different playoff basketball was than the regular season and how game plan specific everything was. And, I think Domantas Sabonis was a little bit surprised and maybe even caught off guard that given the way he was defended all season and given how often the Kings were, cutting and having players available for backdoor layups and spot up threes, the Warriors really overplayed all those things and sort of tried to make the Kings play left-handed, or I guess in their case, right-handed, since they have so many talented left-handed players, playing with their offhand. And then it just, it sort of turned into what we saw in Game 7, which was everybody tightening up, not really having an answer for what the Warriors were posing. And, Steph Curry scored 50 points.
Yeah, that guy's pretty good. Well, like building up to the playoffs, we're hearing all about like the physicality on defense. It's going to pick up. Are the Kings prepared for the physicality? And Domantas Sabonis is someone who has a very physical game. He likes to play physical. I thought it was interesting that we hear all this talk of physicality, and then the entire Warriors game plan against Sabonis was back off of him. And then when he comes into the paint and tries to lower the shoulder into you, that's where you would see the Warriors kind of swarm a little bit and try and clog him and force him into a bad decision. So, like, it sounds so simple just to say, if Sabonis hits that mid-range jumper, that game plan falls apart. But is that really accurate? Like, let's say the Warriors, we're going to see the Warriors on opening night. Let's say or the home opener, I should say. Let's say the Warriors give Sabonis 4 of those wide open mid-range jumpers in the first quarter. It's the same thing. Kevon Looney is backing off of him. If Sabonis hits 2 or 3 of them, do the Warriors abandon that game plan, or do they stick with it and force him to make that shot all night?
I think the Warriors are generally pretty staunch in terms of like, these are what the numbers say. We would bank on these numbers reverting to the mean as the game goes on, right? Because I think over the years, you watch the Warriors closely, their level of defensive intensity, I guess during the regular season in particular, feels a lot different in the first and second quarter than after, the third and fourth quarter. Like the Warriors when they were winning championships would really clamp down from like the 8-minute mark on in the fourth quarter. Like that was sort of their calling card. It was like, all right, they took their defense to a different level than it was previous in earlier in the game. So I think ultimately they're going to let him shoot even late in the game. And you see the Warriors have often, and sometimes it's been to their detriment. Sometimes they'll run into hot shooting nights from guys who aren't considered good 3-point shooters at the NBA level. But they'll stick to it and they'll say, look, if you're a 25% 3-point shooter, and even if you made 3 in the first quarter, we're still going to leave you alone in the fourth quarter because that's not your game. That's not what you're used to doing. So, we've won this many championships and we're going to test you. And like, if you can beat a team that's won this many championships by shooting threes, despite your history of shooting 25% or whatever, they'll still bank on that. So I think particularly opening night or the home opener, like you said, like, I don't think they're going to deviate too much from that game plan. I think ultimately they're going to force Domantas Sabonis to beat them from the mid-range because, look, they would rather do that than allow De'Aaron Fox to get downhill or allow Keegan Murray spot up threes. So I just think that that's ultimately going to be the game plan until Sabonis proves that he can hit that shot. And really, like, we talked that it's talked about that, Domantas Sabonis can be like a Nikola Jokic light. The real difference, though, is Jokic hits threes. Like Jokic will hit the crazy fadeaway bailout threes and is somebody that you really have to honor from the perimeter, even in the playoffs, obviously.
Right.
So that to me is a huge difference in terms of like stylistically, they're similar in that they're passing big men. Obviously they do it in different ways, but a real key difference between Domantas Sabonis and Nikola Jokic is that Jokic can score anywhere, within 30 feet of the hoop. And so I don't think the Kings are ever planning on Domantas Sabonis to get to that level, but if he starts hitting 50% of his mid-range shots and you have to honor it, then that really allows the Kings offense to expand because then you do have to play him there. And then that does create space away from the hoop and allows for backdoor cutters and all the off ball action with somebody going out to 3-point line, someone going to the hoop, all that stuff works a little bit more when Domantas Sabonis is hitting those shots.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Birddogs. Their khaki shorts specifically look so good on you no matter what your body type is like. Their stretch khakis, they fit slimmer through the thigh and the legs, giving you a truly sculpted look. They're incredibly comfortable and they can be used for so many different social events. I've talked a lot before about how I use Birddog shorts when I go out golfing. They're comfortable and they're perfect for a setting like that. You can use their shorts or pants if you're going to a nice event, a semi-formal or a casual event, does not matter. You can pull them off. But really, in addition to how comfortable Birddogs is, like they're really, really good for all of us in just our day-to-day life with, for example, their cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches. So you get that slimmer, more comfortable fit. They have an anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. So if you're in the hot summer months, which, yeah, we're still going through, even though fall is getting closer and closer, football season's about to kick off, it's still hot outside, and that sweat wicking fabric or that anti-sweat wicking fabric is just unbelievable. So go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA or enter promo code LockedOnNBA at checkout for a free Birddogs water bottle with your order. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA for a free water bottle at checkout. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you that. Do you think it's a good thing that Sabonis is going to be put to the test again by the same team so early in the season? And we might even see, and this will lead into another question that I'll ask a little bit later, but we might even see the Utah Jazz try and implement some kind of similar game plan on the actual opener in Utah 2 nights before the home opener. But do you think it's a good thing that, I mean, once again, the Kings and Warriors are playing, 3 times before December? I don't know why the NBA did that. It's absurd. But either way, Sabonis early on is going to get a chance to address those demons. Is that a good thing? And if he still struggles, is that cause for concern?
I don't know. I've seen, you see it in the NBA so often that like it doesn't really feel like the season starts till January.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, yeah, I guess opening night could be an interesting test case for Sabonis and where his mind's at and maybe he comes out and has a huge game and has a 30-point triple-double. But even then, even if he did that, I don't know that necessarily portends to expecting him to do that in the playoffs if the Warriors were to get the Kings again, or the Kings were to get the Warriors again. This is a Kings podcast. I need to remember that. But not like, so I don't know. I think generally, I mean, I'm sort of the mind that like the NBA regular season can be overrated. Obviously, they're little, there's games within the game, and obviously Domantas Sabonis against Kevon Looney is going to be something that's really worth watching closely and talking about into that game. But whether it goes, whether Sabonis has a huge night and a triple-double and a Kings win, or he scores 12 points with 8 rebounds and 2 assists and the Kings lose, I ultimately don't think it's going to mean a whole lot, because what happens throughout the entire season over the large 82 game sample is more important than just what happens on opening night. So for me, I think the smartest NBA teams are building throughout the season and not putting all of their eggs into one basket being opening night. I think it's just about getting better, getting incrementally better, making sure all your guys are healthy, and then do whatever you need to do to be the best version of yourself come playoff time. Because even like, the 73 win Warriors were, I mean, you can make a strong case that they were so wiped out from all the effort they put into the regular season that really hampered them when they got to the playoffs, because Steph Curry was worn down. Andre Iguodala had a back injury. Obviously the Draymond suspension happened, but I think if you were to ask them and talk to them about it, like, they put so much effort into winning 73 games during the regular season that they just didn't have the same level of juice they had for the playoffs. And that was a key reason why they lost in the finals to the Cavs. So to me, it's all about just sort of making sure, like, if you're the Kings, you'd love to get a top 4 seed again, right? Just to have home court. But other than that, like, I don't really, for me, it would be more about how can we maximize ourselves for the playoffs rather than trying to, overinflate the value of, the home opener against the Warriors.
See, I agree with you that the NBA regular season is trending more towards overrated, and I think the NBA actually did that to themselves. I think Adam Silver's NBA is kind of that way, to where the playoffs are what matters and regular season really doesn't. I still think the regular season carries significantly more weight for a team like Sacramento than it does Golden State or it does Phoenix, because ultimately, as the Lakers proved last season, these teams get to the playoffs and then come alive. It doesn't matter if it's home or away or home court advantage or not. Like, they know they can beat anybody if they get hot at the right time. A team like Sacramento, a team that is still very goal oriented on, like Monty said it himself, being like a 50-win team. Like, that's one of the checklists of being, they think an actual contender is getting to that 50-win mark. And I think the regular season, considering how little time this core still has had together, I think the regular season is very important for, like, the tightening of things, the workshopping, especially on the defensive end, of figuring things out, to where I expect the Sacramento Kings to make the playoffs again. I expect the Sacramento Kings to make it out of the first round. But I think a lot of that is going to be determined upon how they address, kind of what you said, like how they improve over the course of the regular season. But I do think, I know myself and Kings fans are looking closely at those Warrior games early in the season, and especially opening night too, because a lot of the work that specifically Sabonis needs to do from that series, or what that series exposed, is stuff that you'd think you can address by yourself in a gym an entire offseason, which is, again, getting more comfortable with that mid-range shot, even stepping out to the three-point line from time to time if you need to. So I think, the national audience eye is going to be on that game for obvious reasons, with the playoff rematch and just how fun those two teams are. But while the Kings won't put all their eggs in that basket on that home opener, I think that game has a chance to really set the tone for how the rest of the regular season goes, or for how the Kings assess where they're at based off of that home opener.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I think the most interesting thing about the home opener is really, like, what's the rotation going to look like? How deep is Mike Brown going to go? Because you can look at this roster and some of the additions they made, and you can say, it wouldn't be crazy if their rotation's 11 players deep, right? Like like I really like Kobe Jones. And I think you need to play him because of his versatility, his ability to facilitate. And like he seems to me, and maybe not this year, but somebody who could play in the playoffs at some point. Right. And so how early is he going to be in the rotation? Is he going to be in the rotation early on, or is that going to come later in the season? Chris Duarte, Kessler Edwards, these types of guys are the Kings. One of the issues they had in the Warriors series was just the lack of outside shooting beyond their starters. And the reason why Mike Brown went to Terrence Davis late in the series was because Terrence Davis was more capable of spreading the offense and hitting threes than Davion Mitchell. Conversely, obviously, Steph Curry was able to go at Terrence Davis and score 50 points in Game 7. So do you insulate yourself from that type of scenario by having Chris Duarte, who you think is a better 3-and-D option than Terrence Davis? Can Colby Jones represent some of that? And does that happen early on in the season? And is Kevin Huerter going to be more consistent like we talked about? To me, like I fully, and I'm not like poo-pooing your idea. I fully understand. And I think it's fun, right? Like I do hope Warriors and Kings turns into like a real blue-blooded NBA rivalry. I think it's at a very interesting point because you have sort of the old guard with Steph Curry and the championships that they've won and the fact that they're at the end of their dynasty, whatever that looks like. And the Kings are the ascending team hoping to become what the Warriors were a decade ago. And that, obviously the regional aspect of it is super important, and Kings fans and Warriors fans and all of that. I think all of that is fascinating. But for me, like to get super wrapped up in that element of it for that home opener is missing the forest for the trees a little bit. And I think Mike Brown would say, like, yeah, obviously we want to beat them. Obviously it's an important game. It's our home opener. It's against a team that beat us in the playoffs. But if you get so emotionally wrapped up in that element of it and getting revenge and all of those things, like you only have a limited amount of mental resources to use throughout an NBA season. It's such a long emotional grind that if you really start paying attention to those little subplots as a team, you're expending emotional energy that you'd probably just be better off saving for later in the season in the playoffs. And maybe that's just my opinion, but like, I think I'm more interested from the Kings perspective to see like what's year 2 Keegan Murray look like early on? What's the rotation look like early on? Do they have more depth? Is Chris Duarte going to help? Is Kessler Edwards going to take a step and be somebody that can play defense in the fourth quarter of meaningful games? Is De'Aaron Fox going to take the next step from, all-star to MVP candidate? Can Domantas Sabonis maintain what he did last year and still play at a high level and overcome some of this shooting stuff that plagued them late in that Warriors series? Those are all things that I'm looking at, maybe more so than like, oh, Kings Warriors, and this is a chance for redemption or whatever. Ultimately it's a game in October. Is it October or is it November? It's October.
No, it's October. Yeah,
it's October. It's a game in October when like ultimately when the playoffs come and it's April, May, June, no one's going to really remember what happens in October.
Absolutely. You're right about that. Well, I mean, I think what I'm interested in seeing is are the Kings struggles the same or familiar, or are there new struggles, right? Like the things that the Kings really battle with this season, because there's going to be struggles no matter what. The Kings are not guaranteed to all of a sudden be a number 1 seed. And even so, like number 1 seeds have their tough parts of the season. So we have concerns about the defense. We have concerns about Sabonis's jump shot. We have concerns about the reliance on the shooting or the ability to stay healthy. Like what will the Kings face? Like what adversity will the Kings face? And is it new or is it familiar? And are they capable of overcoming it? I on my most recent episode of Locked On Kings, Chris, I talked about like the biggest concern that I had with the Kings this season. And the obvious answer is like defense or this team's ability to stay healthy the same way they were last season. But to me, the biggest concern was what Mike Brown calls that gap between good to great, and how difficult that gap is and how easy it is to go from bad to good. And It's the unknown of that gap. It's hey, maybe Domantas Sabonis and the Kings can figure out how to beat the Warriors game plan as early as game 2 of the regular season. But when the Warriors throw a different game plan at them, or when the Phoenix Suns throw a game plan at them, or when somebody does something different, or when the Kings struggle in an area that we thought was a strength, how do they overcome that? That's where that's my biggest concern, because it's the unknown with this Kings team. There's going to be things that Sacramento is going to face this season that we didn't see coming. And are they capable of overcoming that, because they're not catching anybody by surprise anymore?
Yeah, like I agree with you 100%. And the thing I think that gets overlooked is like progress is not a straight line, right? It's not always, okay, they were a 3 seed this year, they'll be a 1 seed next year, because naturally they'll just be better. Like the Kings, I think that there's something funny about the dynamic between what the Kings team was last year and the fans and the organization, right? Because the fans and the organization, like people who've been working in the building, have dealt with so much bad stuff over such a prolonged period of time that obviously that carries baggage, right? But the players themselves and Mike Brown himself, they weren't associated with any of that, right? Like De'Aaron Fox is being like the longest tenured player. He hasn't been around for 16 years. So like all that baggage doesn't really mean anything to them. And like anytime, and you were there, like anytime the players or coaches would talk and it would be about, the streak ending and all that, they'd be like, yeah, it's good for the fans, but it doesn't really mean anything to us.
Sure.
And I think that was sort of placed on the Kings as like adversity, but it was kind of like fake adversity. Like it wasn't like felt in the locker room, because those guys haven't been there for 16 years. Like Miguel, the equipment guys felt it, but like the players themselves didn't bear the weight of that 16 years in the same way that was talked about externally, or at least felt by like people within the organization who had been there, and by the fans, of course, who have seen it all. So I would argue that like the Kings didn't really deal with much adversity last year, and everything was pretty easy for them. Like they obviously Domantas Sabonis injured his thumb, and Keegan Murray had his thumb injury that he played through, but like that was kind of it. Like they didn't have to go 6 weeks without De'Aaron Fox at any point. They didn't have to go any considerable amount of time without a starters. Their starting lineup was far and away played the most minutes in the NBA among any 5-man group. And obviously that chemistry that allowed them to play the type of brand of basketball, the free flowing, the rhythmic offensive basketball that they became known for. So I'm with you 100% in the idea of like, it's not always going to be smooth. Like like chances are it's not going to be as smooth as it was last year. And they're going to be hit with an injury to a starter. They're going to be hit with whatever happens with expectations, with, you have, the Kings are not going to sneak up on anybody, and they're going to have to deal with, being a team that other teams prepare for, like, oh, this was a 3 seed last year, we're really going to bring it, instead of like, oh, that we don't know really if the Kings are good or not. Which I think sort of helped the Kings a little bit last year. But I just, I think there are countless examples throughout sports overall, and we even see it in the NFL, right? Like the 2020 Niners, fresh off the Super Bowl revenge tour, everyone's like, oh, they're hungry, they're gonna be better than last year, they're gonna come back and win the Super Bowl. Well, they have a bunch of injuries and they go 6-10. And obviously football in the NBA is not the same, but there's just countless there's countless examples within sports of progress not being linear. And so I think that's really the battle, to Mike Brown's point, to your point, that the Kings are facing this year. To go from good to great is a hell of a lot different than going from bad to good. And that's going to be the challenge. And can they face that challenge when they do get dealt with a De'Aaron Fox has to miss a month type situation, or Domantas Sabonis, does something and can't play? I know he's basically an Iron Man and tries to play through everything, but it's not going to always be as easy as it was for the Kings last year. And how do they manage that? And how does that impact them? Because that's ultimately, like, winning championships is really hard, and that's what players talk about. Dealing with that type of stuff ultimately is going to define how far the Kings can go next year, in my opinion.
Well, Chris, you know me, and I know you love this aspect of me and the eternal optimism that I have with this Kings team. Genuinely, when I look at the additions that they've made, assuming Vezenkov is as good or is capable of kind of copy and paste the skill set that he had in Europe. I'm not saying the numbers because he's going to come off the bench and have a very different role, but the skill set, especially from the 3-point line that he had in Europe, copy and paste that into the Kings system. You'd think that'd work great. Chris Duarte and his rookie numbers when he was playing Sabonis, take that and put that in Sacramento. I think it's going to be great type thing. Colby Jones, the flashes that we saw, take that. So the additions that the Kings have made in addition to keeping this core together, like I believe this is going to be a very difficult team for opponents to game plan against because there's just so many weapons at any given night. I think the Kings offense, while I'm not going to proclaim it's going to be better or the same as their historically good offense last season, I think there's so many weapons that any given night the Kings can explode for the 120s, 130s like they were doing last season. And if it's a night where Fox or Sabonis are off, maybe Keegan's the guy stepping up, Malik Monk's the guy stepping up. I think Davion Mitchell is going to have a better offensive season this year. So when I look at how you game plan against the Kings, I don't know how you stop Sacramento other than what we've seen, which is what the Warriors did. And even then, I think that's beatable. But it's going to require guys to kind of make shots by themselves, taking the team out of it and maybe putting certain guys on an island and saying, you're wide open, you have to hit this shot. When I look at that Warriors game plan, and this is the last thing I have for you, Chris, I don't know how many teams are going to be capable of executing that same or a similar game plan. And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. Like, I guess, how do you expect the wide variety of teams to approach game planning the Sacramento Kings and their offense specifically? Do you think they're going to handle it the same way, or they're going to kind of throw their style at Sacramento and hope it works? And if they do that, then I feel like the Kings are in for another good offensive season.
Yeah, I think you basically sag off Domantas Sabonis just in general, and you try to overplay the dribble handoffs to where you're like immediately trapping the guy who's getting those handoffs and not allowing him to get downhill where they can, the Malik Monk pick and roll, right? It would be a dribble handoff to a pick and roll.
Mm-hmm.
Or, the 3-point shooting. Like I would just try to take away the dribble handoff game. And, I'm not a basketball coach. But that would be my number one thing because, how many of Kevin Huerter's threes came off a dribble handoff? How many of Keegan Murray's did? How many successful pick and rolls did the Kings have with Domantas Sabonis doing a dribble handoff with Malik Monk? I would overplay the dribble handoff and force them to look elsewhere and try to force the Kings to create shots off the dribble. I think De'Aaron Fox is elite, one of the best players in the league at creating his own shot off the dribble. And Malik Monk is really good at that too. But beyond that, the Kings don't have a whole lot of off the dribble scorers. So if I'm trying to defend them, I'm trying to make them put the ball on the deck and not utilize Domantas Sabonis' dribble handoff game and just see if you can create stagnation late in the shot clock where somebody has to dribble and get a shot off the dribble. That's what my game plan will be. It obviously easier said than done because,
Sure.
like I said, De'Aaron Fox is a lead at creating his own shot off the dribble. I think a lot of teams too, and this sort of speaks to, we don't know how improved the Kings defense is going to be. They certainly ratcheted it up in the playoffs last year, but can you outscore them? Like, it's going to be extremely difficult. Obviously, it was, like you said, it was the best offensive rating of all time last year, but there are deficiencies the Kings have defensively, or on a given night, you could say, all right, well, we might not be able to stop you, but we're going to try to outscore you. And maybe the Kings, the Kings regular season defense was obviously a lot different than the playoffs, and maybe opponents could take advantage of that. But the fact that we're having this conversation speaking to how difficult it's going to be to outscore the Kings, and how, for the most part, I think their offense is pretty diverse and pretty difficult to defend. That speaks volumes to just where they're at organizationally as a franchise and how good they potentially could be, because, there was no way we were having this discussion a couple of years ago. It was, who's going, De'Aaron Fox or Tyrese Halliburton? But now it's how do they go from good to great? So I think that's a really fun place for the Kings to be and for Kings fans, in terms of, the product they get to watch every night, is that we're picking nits about, the best offense statistically in recent memory, and how it translates to the playoffs. But no, I think, I would expect Domantas Sabonis to be ready for teams blitzing the dribble handoff game, and we'll see what type of wrinkles they have to counteract that. Or is it just their bread and butter, and do they stick with it sort of no matter what? So I'm interested to see what that looks like too. But if you're asking me how I would defend the Kings, and again, not a basketball coach, but that's where I would start.
It's going to be interesting too. We're not going to get to see it as media members because there's no way Mike will give us a peek into that in training camp. But I imagine in training camp and in preseason, that's going to be a major focus too of the Kings, is trying to figure out how to handle when defenses blitz that dribble handoff and not allow the Kings to take themselves out of their element as much as the Warriors did to them in the playoffs. But only time will tell. Chris, you do a phenomenal job covering all the sports that you possibly can cover. You also dabble in high school football as well during high school football season, which is going on right now too. So keep up the great work, my friend. And I look forward to having you on frequently during the Kings season. That'll be here before we know it. Still feels so far away, but hopefully Niners football will help us bridge that gap a bit.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Hopefully Nick Bosa signs and we can start talking about on-field stuff instead of off-field 49ers drama. I think I've had my fill of that. I'm ready to talk about real football. It's going to be fun. And basketball, obviously, when King season gets here.
Cover the Sacramento Kings for 16 years of crap. You'll be happy to talk about anything that's happening on the floor. Trust me. So I understand you will, Chris. Thank you, brother.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Huge thank you to Chris for joining me on the Locked On Kings podcast. Really, truly is always a pleasure to have him on. Love talking Kings basketball with him, and basketball and sports in general. He does an amazing job covering the Kings. Check out his work over at the Sacramento Bee. And then Niners fans, go and listen to the Candlestick Chronicles podcast too. It's, in my opinion, the best Niners podcast out there. So really appreciate Chris taking the time here. I think a lot of what he said is very accurate. I'm obviously more optimistic than he is about the Kings and their ability to defeat the game plan that the Warriors threw at them and the game plans that other teams will throw at them. But I know you have reactions. I know you have thoughts to some of the things Chris and I discussed. You can share those with me at any time at Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, or leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. Appreciate your support as always. I have a great podcast idea coming up too. I considered talking about it with Chris in this conversation, but I realized, I want to spend a whole episode on this. If the Sacramento Kings had the choice of facing the Golden State Warriors again in the playoffs or facing the field in the Western Conference, what would they choose? Would they choose the Warriors who they're familiar with, who they took the 7 games and nearly beat and look for revenge against Golden State? Or would they choose to face a different team, a new team that might throw a new game plan at the Kings, or might try to execute the Warriors game plan, but not be able to do so as effectively? I think that'd be a really fun conversation to have, because part of me does believe that the Sacramento Kings are eager for revenge against Golden State. I really think we're getting a true Kings and Warriors rivalry this season, and I'm very excited about that. So I'll discuss that going forward, have more great guests and more great topics like that coming this week and in future weeks of the Locked On Kings podcast. So can't wait to have you join me on those next episodes. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.